Right now, as you're watching this, there are live cost trackers online estimating how much money the United States is burning in Iran, updating every second. Based on nonpartisan defense analyses, those numbers suggest we are already in the tens of billions of dollars range if this pace continues for weeks, not years. One widely cited estimate from a Washington think tank puts U.S. spending on the current war at roughly $890 million per day in the opening phase. That means while you slept last night, while you made your morning coffee, while you drove your kids to school, America likely spent close to another $1 billion on a war a majority of Americans tell pollsters they do not support.
But here's the part almost nobody talks about. This money is not some abstract government number floating in the sky. It is ultimately coming from you through taxes today, higher prices at the store, and higher government debt your family will be paying interest on for decades.
If this war runs for just around 4 to 5 weeks at current spending levels, some economists' central case estimates for the total economic hit work out to roughly $800–900 per U.S. household on average. For many families, that's not a rounding error. That's close to 2 months of groceries.
And that's only the beginning, because the real cost, the one that will haunt this country for the next 20 or 30 years, goes far beyond anything a flashy ticker on a website can count.
Today, we're going to tear apart the numbers, trace where the money goes, and show how this war is draining your bank account in ways you can see and ways you can't. Let's dig in.
You probably felt the first punch before you even realized a war had started: gas prices. In late February, the national average for regular gas was just under $3 a gallon. Within days of the fighting and the shipping disruptions, that average started climbing by several dozen cents a gallon across many parts of the country. Short-term forecasts from fuel price trackers now put the national average in the mid-$3 range if things stabilize. But energy analysts, including former government energy advisors, warn that if the Strait of Hormuz stays heavily disrupted, we could be looking at national averages north of $4 a gallon again. And that's not some far-fetched what-if scenario. The disruption is already happening. Here's something most Americans don't realize. There is a narrow strip of water between Iran and Oman called the Strait of Hormuz. At its tightest point, it's only about 20 miles wide, and roughly 1/5 of all the oil traded in the world passes through it every single day. Think of it like this. Imagine a highway that carries 1 out of every 5 trucks delivering fuel to the planet. Now imagine someone turns that highway into a war zone. Since the war broke out, multiple shipping and energy outlets have reported that tanker traffic through the strait has plunged, with some days seeing only a fraction of the normal crude tankers willing to transit. Insurance companies have either jacked up war risk premiums or pulled coverage altogether. No insurance means fewer ships. Fewer ships means less oil moves. Less oil means higher prices, not just here, but everywhere. And oil doesn't just power your car. It's baked into the price of almost everything you buy. The diesel that trucks and trains run on has already jumped by several dozen cents in a matter of days. When trucking gets more expensive, shipping gets more expensive. When shipping gets more expensive, everything on those trucks, the apples at your grocery store, the diapers, the chicken, the laundry detergent, the packages on your porch, all of it creeps up in price. Business and economics outlets have been blunt about this. This war is likely to push up prices across the U.S. economy, not just at the pump. Food economists warned that global conflicts rarely stay geopolitical for long. They show up on your receipt. Major papers have summarized the risk in one sentence: rising energy prices, snarled supply chains, and higher government borrowing costs all eventually land on the backs of American consumers. So let's run the numbers on what this actually means at the pump for a typical driver. The average American drives somewhere around 12,000 miles a year. And to keep the math simple, let's say they get about 25 miles per gallon. That's roughly 480 gallons a year. Now layer on today's spike. If gas is roughly 35 cents a gallon more expensive than it was just before the crisis, that's an extra $168 per driver per year. For a two-car household, that's about $336 that was not in your budget a month ago. And that's just at today's levels. If we hit a scenario where national averages go to the low $4 range, say prices end up about $1.25 higher than pre-war levels, that's around $600+ per driver per year. Now you're talking over $1,200 for a family with two cars. And remember, that's just gasoline. That number does not include the ripple effects on your grocery bill, your heating or cooling bill, your Amazon deliveries, your Uber rides, your flights, and every other part of life that depends on moving stuff from point A to point B. Now pull back and look at the direct military tab, the money the Pentagon is spending right now, today, in your name. A nonpartisan defense think tank in Washington broke down the costs for the opening days of the war. Their estimate? In roughly the first 100 hours, the U.S. spent about $3.7 billion on the conflict. That works out to around $890 million per day. Other outlets that reviewed the same figures reported similar daily cost ranges for those first few days of heavy operations. That daily bill covers a mix of things. Air operations, everything from strategic bombers to fighter jets, drones, surveillance aircraft, and the tankers and cargo planes that keep them flying. Naval operations, aircraft carrier strike groups, guided missile destroyers, submarines, and all the logistics needed to keep a fleet in the region. Ground forces, troops and equipment staging in nearby countries, bases on higher alert, and support units spread across the region. Munitions, precision-guided bombs, cruise missiles, air defense interceptors, and other high-end weapons. The munitions are where the numbers really explode. Modern bunker-buster bombs can cost many millions of dollars each. Long-range cruise missiles run into the millions per shot. Surface-to-air interceptors used to knock down incoming missiles and drones can be hundreds of thousands to millions of dollars apiece. When you're firing dozens or hundreds of these in a short span, the bill climbs at an insane pace. The key point, this isn't a hypothetical shopping list. These are the kinds of weapons and systems being used right now. And at nearly $900 million per day, we're already past the average daily cost of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars combined. Once you adjust for the fact that those conflicts stretched over almost 20 years. And here's another twist. So far, the Pentagon has not gone to Congress for a big new special war funding package. Instead, these costs are being folded into existing budgets at emergency authorities, which means they are piling on top of an already huge deficit and a national debt that's north of $30 trillion. Let's make $890 million a day feel real, because numbers at this scale make your brain shut down. So let's translate. According to federal statistics, the average American household spends roughly $500 a month on groceries. One day of this war, $890 million, could cover a full month of groceries for about 1.7 million families. That's roughly the size of a major U.S. city. City fed for a month in a single day of war. Average in-state tuition at a public university runs in the ballpark of $11,000 to $12,000 a year. One day of war spending could pay a year of tuition for around 70,000 to 80,000 students. Tuition paid in full for a big university's entire enrollment gone in 24 hours of bombing. The average monthly rent in America is in the $1,600 to $1,700 range. One day of this war could pay a month's rent for over 500,000 households. That's more families than you'll find in many big U.S. metro areas. And then there's food assistance. Federal spending on SNAP, the program that helps low-income Americans buy groceries, runs on the order of several billion dollars a month. At current burn rates, a single week of this war eats up more money than nearly a month of food aid for tens of millions of Americans. The average SNAP benefit is just a few dollars per person per day. The amount we've decided is enough to keep a vulnerable American fed, while we spend close to $1 billion a day dropping bombs 6,000 miles away.
Those are the visible costs, things the government actually writes checks for in this year's budget. But the invisible costs are even more dangerous. Economists who've tried to model the broader impact of a short, intense war with Iran have come up with some sobering ranges. For a conflict lasting a couple of months, direct military spending alone could easily run into tens of billions of dollars.
Once you factor in oil shocks, supply chain disruptions, lost work hours, market turmoil, and higher interest rates, the overall hit to the U.S. economy could land somewhere around $50 to over $200 billion, depending on how bad things get.
Take a middle-of-the-road case. Say the all-in cost ends up around $115 billion. Divide that by roughly 130-plus million American households, and you get a back-of-the-envelope figure of around $800, $900 per household on average.
That $861 number you've heard thrown around online comes from exactly this kind of simple division.
Now, is that a perfect measure? No. Real life is messier. The actual hit to your family depends on your income, where you live, how much you drive, whether you own stocks or a home, what you buy, and what kind of work you do. But it gives you a sense of scale.
This is not a couple of bucks we can ignore. It's rent, it's groceries, it's car payments, it's the margin between barely keeping up and falling behind.
And remember, this money isn't coming from some mythical government vault full of cash. The United States is already running big deficits, so most of this will be added to the national debt, then slowly repaid with interest by you, your children, and your grandchildren.
We've seen this movie before. When the U.S. invaded Iraq in 2003, early official estimates talked about tens of billions of dollars.
Later academic studies, including the well-known costs of war work, put the true long-term price tag for Iraq and Afghanistan combined in the range of $5 to $6 trillion once you include veterans' care, interest on the debt, and related costs.
In other words, the final bill ended up tens of times higher than the upfront promises. And right now, there's no clear exit ramp. Senior defense officials are talking about escalating pressure, not winding down. Political leaders have floated timelines like a couple of weeks, a month or two, as long as it takes, but nobody seems to know for sure.
For context, keep this in mind. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan lasted roughly 20 years and cost about $5.8 trillion in total, according to some of the most respected research on U.S. war spending.
If you average that out, you get roughly $790 million per day over 2 decades. The Iran war, in its opening phase, is already running closer to $890 million per day by some estimates. We have blown past the average daily cost of the longest, most expensive wars in U.S. history in less than a week.
And that doesn't even count the second-order effects. Major banks and Wall Street research shops are warning that a drawn-out conflict with Iran could mean higher oil prices, hotter inflation, delayed interest rate cuts, a shakeup in stock market leadership.
And more volatility. The S&P 500 just had one of its worst weeks in months as investors tried to price in exactly these risks.
So where does this leave you? Not the country, not the markets, you. It leaves you paying more at the pump, going from under $3 a gallon to the low 3s or higher in a matter of days, with the very real possibility of $4 plus gas if the Strait of Hormuz stays disrupted. It leaves you watching grocery prices tick up again because diesel is more expensive and every truck and train in America runs on it. It leaves you facing a potential $800 plus hit to your household over a few weeks of war once you add up direct public spending.
Higher prices and financial ripple effects.
And it leaves you and your kids on the hook for billions in new debt that will quietly accrue interest for years, long after this particular war has dropped out of the headlines.
Polls show that more Americans disapprove of this kind of large-scale military action than support it. In some surveys, outright opposition clearly outnumbers support. And yet, here we are. American troops have already died, U.S. aircraft have been lost, and the cost counter keeps spinning. I want to leave you with one image.
Imagine you're standing at a gas station, filling up your tank. Above the pump, there's a little screen, the kind that usually runs ads or weather. But instead of car commercials, it's showing a number. How much of your tax money has gone to the war in Iran since you started pumping? The number is spinning so fast you can barely read it. By the time you've put 15 gallons into your car, another few $100,000 have been burned on operations half a world away.
In the time it takes you to fill one tank, this country has spent more on war than many families see in years. That is the war nobody really asked you about, but everyone is paying for. Around $890 million a day. Roughly $800 to $900 per household if this keeps up for just a few weeks, and counting. If this opened your eyes, do me a favor, hit that subscribe button. Share this with someone who needs to see what these numbers actually mean, and drop a comment. I genuinely want to know, what would $861 mean for your family? Because for a lot of people watching this, that isn't budget noise. That is rent. That is groceries. That is real life. Would you like me to trim this into a tighter 8 to 10 minute YouTube script, or keep the long form style and add more pauses and hook lines for retention?